Am I really about to tell this story? All right then. In September of 1931, in a lonely farmhouse on the west coast of the Isle of Man, a farmer called James Irving began hearing something moving inside the walls. At first, it sounded like an animal scratching behind the wooden panels, scuffling in the dark spaces of the house. The kind of noise you might expect from a rat or some other kind of small creature that has found its way into an old building. The farmhouse was called Dawlish Cashen, and it sat near a place known as Cashen's Gap, not far from the village of Dalby. It was remote, exposed, and difficult to reach. The sort of place where bad weather could make a house feel cut off from the rest of the island. Living there were James Irving, his wife Margaret, and their teenage daughter Voirrey. They weren't wealthy people, they lived a hard, practical, isolated life. And like many families in rural places, they were used to strange noises at night. Old houses move, animals get inside, wind comes through gaps and turns ordinary sounds into something much stranger. So when James Irving first heard noises in the walls, there was no reason to assume that anything supernatural was happening. But then the noises began to change. The animal, whatever it was, seemed to copy sounds. It mimicked birds. It made barking noises. It chattered and squeaked and knocked from inside the panels. Then, according to the Irvings, it did something that no farmyard pest should ever be able to do. It spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is William, and this is the Baker Street Bureau. If true crime, paranormal, and the outright unexplainable are your thing, you're in the right place. Before we dive into the video, if you like the cut of my jib, there's a great big like button down there just waiting for you to click it. Now, this is the weird, wild, and outright outlandish tale of Gef the Talking Mongoose. After a short while, the creature introduced itself as Gef. It said it was a mongoose and claimed to have been born in Delhi in 1852. It sang songs, swore at people, listened to family conversations, stole food. It claimed to travel around the island and announced that it was, in its own words, an extra clever mongoose. For years, the Irving family insisted that this creature lived with them inside the walls of their own home. Now, Gef the Talking Mongoose is one of those stories that sounds ridiculous the moment you say it out loud. It sounds like a children's story, like some sort of local legend that should fall apart the second that anyone takes it seriously. But serious people did take it seriously. Reporters came, psychic investigators came. Harry Price, one of the most famous paranormal investigators of the 20th century, became involved. So did a guy called Richard Lambert, a respected BBC editor. Later, Nando Fodor, another major figure in psychical research, travelled to the Isle of Man to investigate the case for himself. Now, they didn't find a clean answer. They found a strange family in a strange house, telling a strange story that had grown far beyond a few noises in the walls. And nearly half a century later, people are still asking the same question. Was Gef a hoax? Was he a psychological condition born out of isolation? Or did something genuinely unexplainable happen inside that farmhouse at Cashen's Gap? To understand why anyone believed this story in the first place, we have to begin with the house. Dawlish Cashen was not, by any means, a cozy little cottage in the middle of a village. It was an isolated farmhouse surrounded by rough land with the sea not that far away and the hills rising around it. The nearest neighbours weren't simply next door, and for a young girl like Voirrey Irving, the place could feel incredibly lonely. Voirrey was around 13 when the strange events began. She was the only child in the house, growing up in an environment where there were animals, fields, weather, hard work, and very little ordinary teenage life. Her father, James, was a strong personality. Talkative, curious, imaginative, and deeply involved with the events that followed. Margaret, her mother, was quieter in the records, but she also became part of the family's claims. The farmhouse itself seems to have helped the mystery grow. It had wooden paneling and spaces in the walls where sound could travel in confusing ways. A voice from behind a panel might not be easy to locate. A knock in one room could seem to come from another. In that kind of building, especially at night, the house almost becomes part of the story. At first, James Irving thought the creature might be some kind of animal infestation, but the noises became increasingly odd. And then came the moment that changed everything. The Irvings claimed that the animal began forming words. It supposedly spoke in a high-pitched voice, sometimes sharp, sometimes mocking, and over time, it developed a personality so detailed that Gef stopped being a thing in the walls and became almost like a fourth member of the household. He claimed to be a mongoose, which is already strange because mongooses aren't native to the Isle of Man. Then he added the detail that he was from Delhi and had been born in the 19th century, which makes things even stranger. This wasn't simply a talking animal. This was a talking animal with a biography. Gef was rude. He was funny. He would sing, gossip, make jokes. He reportedly ate their food and stole small items. He would throw things around the house and leave little paw prints behind. He also claimed to help the family by catching rabbits. Now, all of these things kept Gef connected to the everyday life at the farm. He wasn't just a ghostly voice floating in the dark. He had jobs, moods, habits. To the Irvings, he wasn't an occasional haunting. He was present. Now, most ghost stories involve moments of shock. A knock, a shadow, a gloomy figure at the end of a hallway. Something that happens and then sort of dissipates. But Gef was different. He became routine. If this was a hoax, it wasn't a simple one. It required time, performance, consistency, and a willingness to live inside the story every single day. And that brings us to Voirrey. From the beginning, Voirrey Irving was the person most closely connected to Gef. She was young, isolated, and often treated by writers as the most likely source of the voice. And it's easy to see why. A teenage girl in a lonely house with a hidden voice that sings, jokes, rebels, insults adults, and demands attention. Maybe Gef was Voirrey. Maybe she discovered she could throw her voice. And maybe she created him as a game, and when her father believed it, or seemed to believe it, the game became way too big for her to stop. Maybe Gef gave her a way to say the things that she couldn't say herself. But the case isn't quite that neat. Voirrey denied creating Gef for the rest of her life, even decades later when the fame had faded and there was little obvious benefit in continuing the story. She still maintained that Gef had been real, or at least that he hadn't been invented by her. Now, that denial doesn't prove anything on its own. People can cling to stories for many reasons. They can protect family myths, avoid humiliation, or even preserve a version of childhood that became too important to let go. But it does mean that the emotional center of the case isn't simply a girl that fooled people. The better question is, what did Gef mean to Voirrey? In a house where life was remote and difficult, Gef may have been entertainment, companionship, rebellion, and escape all rolled into one. Through Gef, the very quiet farmhouse became famous. Through Gef, Voirrey became part of a mystery that reached far beyond Cashin's Gap. And through Gef, the Irvings had something that made people come to them, listen to them, and treat their isolated home as the center of something extraordinary. Now, that doesn't make the story true, but it does make it more interesting. Because once Gef entered the public world, the story began to change again. Locals heard rumors. Newspapers became interested. Visitors came to the house hoping to hear the mysterious voice. Now, some left disappointed, but others claimed they heard something. The Irvings were no longer just telling each other a strange story by the fire, they were telling the whole world. And that's when everything becomes harder to dismiss, because although many claims rely heavily on the Irving family themselves, there were outside witnesses who said they'd experienced something unusual. One visitor by the name of Harold Dennis reportedly heard Gef speaking from inside the house and describing his clothing. Other people claimed to hear the voice when Voirrey was visible, or when it seemed impossible for her to be the source. These accounts are exactly the kind of thing that keep a story alive. They don't prove the impossible, but they stop the story from collapsing. Because if Gef was only Voirrey, how did visitors hear him when she was supposedly elsewhere? If the voice was James Irving, why would he risk turning his family into a laughingstock? And if Margaret was involved, was this a shared family hoax? And if so, what were they hoping to gain? These questions were never answered cleanly, and by the mid-1930s, the story had attracted the attention of people who specialized in strange cases. Harry Price was the biggest name connected to Gef. He was already famous for investigating hauntings, seances, mediums, and alleged supernatural events. He was skeptical of many claims, but he was also drawn to cases that had publicity value, and Gef certainly had that. In 1935, Price and Richard Lambert became involved in the investigation, and the following year they published a book called The Haunting of Cashin's Gap. The title alone helped turn Gef from a local oddity into a wider paranormal legend. But when investigators arrived, Gef wasn't exactly cooperative. This is another reoccurring feature of the case. Gef was supposedly talkative when conditions suited him, but when outsiders came demanding proof, he became difficult, evasive, or silent. This is familiar territory for paranormal cases. The phenomenon always happens around people who believe in it. It's weakest around skeptics and almost impossible to capture under controlled conditions. Still, some physical evidence was gathered. There were photographs, though none clearly show the extraordinary animal. There were plaster casts of the alleged paw prints. There were samples of hair said to have come from Gef. Now, that should have been a turning point. If a mysterious mongoose-like creature was really living inside the walls of Dawlish Cashin, then hair samples might prove it. Even if the animal wasn't supernatural, the discovery of an actual mongoose on the Isle of Man would have been strange enough. But the evidence didn't support the family's claims. The hair samples were examined and didn't appear to belong to a mongoose. Instead, the explanation pointed much closer to home. The hairs were consistent with a dog, and the Irving family had a sheepdog called Mona. The revelation damages the case quite a bit, because once the best physical evidence points towards the family dog, the whole story begins to look different. Gef's fur is not exotic, his footprints are not decisive, and the photographs are unclear. His voice can't be tested, and his movements can't be verified. Now, for skeptics, that's enough. Gef was not a talking mongoose. Gef was a family performance, probably involving ventriloquism, misdirection, and a household willing to keep a story alive. And honestly, might be the most likely explanation. But this isn't the end of the story, because even if Gef wasn't real in a literal sense, something really strange still happened at Cashin's Gap. The family lived with the story for years. They fed it, defended it. They shaped their whole lives around it, and they invited investigators into their home because of it. Their private world became fused with the idea of this invisible creature in the walls. This is where Nando Fodor's interpretation becomes important. Fodor was less interested in treating Gef as a straightforward animal or ghost. He was more interested in what the case said about the people involved. He saw the possibility that Gef was a psychological phenomena, not necessarily a conscious hoax in the simple sense, but a projection of hidden tensions, needs, and emotions inside the Irving household. In other words, Gef may have been fake as a mongoose, but real as a symptom. And that gives us a bit of a darker edge, because when you listen to what Gef did, he often behaved like a voice that could say what others couldn't. He could be rude to visitors. He could demand attention. He could be clever, cruel, childish, funny, dramatic. He belonged to everyone and no one. If anyone challenged him, he could vanish back into the walls. For a lonely girl, Gef could be freedom. For her father, Gef could be proof that his remote, difficult life contained something remarkable. For the household, Gef could be company, status, entertainment, an escape. And for the public, Gef became exactly the kind of mystery people love. Absurd enough to be funny, strange enough to be unsettling, and ambiguous enough to survive every attempt to explain it. Over time, the story faded. The Irvings eventually left Dawlish Cashen. Gef disappeared from family life, at least as far as the record is concerned. The farmhouse itself no longer stands in the way it once did, and the people at the center of the case are gone. Voirrey lived for many decades after the events and carried the story with her, still denying that she had simply invented the creature. That final detail, quite easily overlooked, but it really means something. If Gef was a childhood prank, it became a lifelong burden. If Gef was a family hoax, it was one that Voirrey never chose to expose. And if Gef was something more complicated, perhaps even she didn't fully understand what had happened in that house. So, where does that leave us? The rational answer is that Gef was almost certainly not a talking mongoose from Delhi living in the walls of a family farmhouse. The physical evidence is weak and the claims are inconsistent. The setup is full of opportunities for trickery. The isolated house, hidden wall spaces, a young girl at the center of the story, and evidence pointing to the family dog all make supernatural explanations a bit more unnecessary. But the human answer is stranger, because the real mystery of Gef isn't whether mongooses can talk. I'm fairly confident that they can't. The real mystery is how a family became so attached to the idea that one could, how scratches in the wall became a voice, how a voice became a character, how a character became famous, and how a ridiculous story about a rude little animal in a farmhouse managed to outlive almost everyone who heard it firsthand. Gef is often treated as a joke, and to be fair, parts of the story are genuinely funny. A swearing mongoose that eats chocolate and insults investigators is quite hard to present with a straight face, but underneath the absurdity, it's something more uncomfortable. Dawlish Cashen was a lonely place. The Irving family were isolated. Voirrey was growing up in a world that seems to have offered her very little ordinary freedom. Into that silence came a voice that could do what the people in the house couldn't. It could speak without consequences. It could mock authority. It could make the outside world pay attention. And maybe that's why Gef lasted as long as he did. Not because he was a ghost, not because he was a miracle, not because he was an extra clever mongoose, but because for a time, the Irvings needed him to be there. In the end, Gef the Talking Mongoose remains one of Britain's strangest paranormal cases because every explanation still leaves something behind. If it was a hoax, it was an unusually committed one. If it was psychological, it took on a life of its own. If it was simply a joke, it somehow became the defining story of an entire family. And if you strip away the mongoose, the voices, the paw prints, investigators, and the strange claims about Delhi, what you're left with is a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, a lonely family, and a voice coming from behind the walls. A voice that said its name was Gef. And nearly 100 years later, people are still listening. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is William, and this is the Baker Street Bureau. When I first decided that I wanted to tell stories about the dark and mysterious things that happened across Great Britain, I never thought I'd tell one about a talking mongoose called Gef. So if you've made it this far, thank you for coming on this journey with me. This was a fun one. Things have gotten a little crazy over here lately, and I just, again, hand on heart, wanted to say thank you. I record these videos in batches because I have a very, very busy life. So the last few videos were recorded at the same time, and you'll notice that I mention about having 200 subscribers, 300 subscribers. Yeah. So now this is the first video that I'm recording ever since we went over 1,000, and I'm blown away. So I have to really thank you for all of the positive comments, for believing in me. I've got a lot to learn about how to do so many things. I'm improving at my writing. I'm trying to work out how to sound treat this room so it doesn't sound like I'm recording a video on the surface of the moon. There's a lot to learn, and whilst trying to stay consistent and consistently make videos in my spare time, what little spare time I have, I'll get there. And I believe in myself, and I appreciate you believing in me too. So, thank you for choosing to spend your precious time with me and Gef the Talking Mongoose today. So I'll leave you to the rest of your day. Go check out some other videos while you're here, but if I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.